everyone. Today I have with me author, professor, historian William C. Davis. And I'm talking with Mr. Davis today about a book he wrote back in 1991 called Jefferson Davis, The Man and His Hour. Thank you so much for talking with me today. And I will call you Jack because you said everybody calls you Jack. So
yes, please do. Please do. I'm happy to be with you, Michelle.
Okay. Well, I have to tell everybody who hasn't read this book that I love history books. And I read a lot of H.W. Brands, which is why I think your book came up also around, because I was reading around the Civil War time. And I thought that his books were large until I got to this book, okay? And this book is, well, I was reading it on my Kindle mostly, and it was, I think it came up to like 900 pages about Jefferson Davis. So, you know, this is not for the light of heart.
Not for the faint of heart, no.
Not for the faint of heart. But I have to tell you, it is still a page turner. And I am a history buff, and so I love history books. But even if that isn't what you think your thing is, you will read this book, and it's like reading a novel. And the way that you describe him and everything that's going on at that time, I thought I knew a lot, and I learned so much more from it. So I'm very grateful that I was able to read it. But I have to ask you, because I saw all the books you've written so many books about the Civil War, and you were a professor of history, right, at Virginia Tech.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Was that your main focus? Was the Civil War your main focus then?
It generally has been since I got interested in research and writing, which now is 50 years ago. It's shocking to realize. I've worked in other areas, mostly in Southern history, and especially in what's called the history of the Old Southwest. That's that Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana area back in the early 1800s. It's very interesting. But primarily, probably 80% of my work has been in the field of general overall Civil War studies.
Well, and you are a Southern man. You were born in Missouri, correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And so I come from Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania. And the thing that I find so interesting about that is when I think back to my time in school and the stuff that we learned about the Civil War, it was a very brief kind of like, north, south. We were the ones who didn't want slavery. They wanted slavery. We won. Let's move on. And Lincoln died, and let's move on. Lincoln died. It was a very, very concise, and as I got older, so I'm a homeschooling mom. I've homeschooled all 6 of my children. So as I was homeschooling them and getting more into history and teaching around history, I learned so much more about what happened during the Civil War and how it wasn't that simple. Okay.
No, it's very, very complex. And unfortunately, just matters of practicality in public school education today, it's simply not practical to devote much time to it. People tend not to think of this, but when I was in high school taking U.S. history, which would have been 1963, 54 years have passed since then.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 20 to 25% more U.S. history to teach in a school that's actually shorter than it was 50 years ago. So
right.
There's just no way teachers can devote much time really to anything. It's no wonder that in most American history classes in high schools, they never get much beyond about 1920.
Right, and that's exactly. I mean, we didn't even get to World War II when I was in school, and I was born in '64, and we brushed right up against World War II, and then it was over.
Right.
But what I kind of, so as I'm reading your book, I was kind of taking a poll of people around me. And, I would say, I'm reading a book on Jefferson Davis, and they're like, Jefferson Davis, that sounds familiar. What did he do? It was so interesting how many people don't know what Jefferson Davis did,
Right. Oh, well, it's pretty shocking in general whenever you see these men on the street polls, especially the college-age young people today think Lincoln was the president before Eisenhower. That's no joke. You get a lot of it. I mean, the historical ignorance is stunning, and that's primarily the failure of older generations who haven't come to grips with finding a way to impart what young people need to know in order to be culturally literate about Americanism, being Americans and American history. And
yeah.
so young people are pretty much thrown on their own resources to go out and learn if they happen to be interested. Otherwise, the degree of ignorance is not only stunning but discouraging.
Yes, and that it was such an important time. I mean, the American Revolution was, of course, very important, but the Civil War was very important. And I told you, like, your book made me even realize how much more was involved and what the states were struggling to do and accomplish at that time in order to make what we have now. And
what makes it even more difficult is that probably more than any other era in our national past, the Civil War era is just deeply encrusted with mythology and nonsense that if it gets in print, people believe it. And it takes a lot of effort to cut through all that, and unfortunately, a lot of the myth is stuff that is very important to people that they hold dear to themselves, and they're not very willing to part with it because they have an emotional investment in it. You find that especially in the South, but it's pretty much nationwide.
Mm-hmm. And so what brought you to Jefferson Davis? What made you want to write a huge book like that, like a huge undertaking it was for you?
I don't know that I wanted to write a huge book. It just came out that way. But they tend to be that way. Davis the voluminous personal papers of his survive. He's involved, of course. He's one of the pivotal figures of the Civil War era. Interesting man, and my feeling at the time, this is 25 years ago or more, is that there still really wasn't a biography that came to grips with him. People still tended to regard him as enigmatic. I didn't really think he was. I don't think he's that difficult to understand. The problem with Davis is he's difficult to like. He's not a man that most of us would like today if we met him. Therefore, it's kind of hard to empathize with him. But it was an interesting research challenge and an interesting big job, and I'm always interested in writing challenges, and especially in areas where maybe they haven't been delved into that deeply before. That wasn't the case with Davis because there have been many biographies, but none of them were very good. And since mine came out, there have been 2 or 3 others, so that the work goes on. Mine's hardly the last word.
But what I loved about the beginning of your book, how you said that you didn't go and read the other biographies. You went based on the letters that were left behind, correct?
Yes. That's pretty much my approach in all of my work, is to avoid reading what others have written about a subject until after I've done all my research, have my own thoughts in mind. And usually after I have them down on paper, rather than risk having my thoughts being skewed by conclusions of others, I prefer to come to my own conclusions. And if they happen to agree with others, that's fine. But it's too easy to absorb things and then unconsciously wind up regurgitating them, thinking them they're your own, when in fact it's just something you remember that someone else wrote. And the research in the primary documents is really all the fun to begin with. Writing is just damned hard work. But the research is kind of like going to a party every day. For an historian, it's about the only place you get to feel like Christopher Columbus, when there's always that next page you can turn beyond which there may be something nobody's ever seen before, and that's enormous fun.
Yeah, and the other historians that I have talked to in the past, they say that the best people to write about are the ones who do leave. Like, there's so many people that didn't leave letters, and something happened to them, they got destroyed somehow, and the fact that so much of his stuff survived, that you could actually, the detail is incredible. Like, I was just amazed at the detail you were able to give into his life.
Yeah, and people in that era, for some reason, tended to save their letters and what they received. People don't do that today very much. I don't know that they necessarily thought that, someday some guy's going to want to write a big fat book about me. They just tended to keep their correspondence. So it's really not that unusual to go through an attic and find a whole steamer trunk full of 100 years' worth of the family's correspondence. it's out of the ordinary, but not that much out of the ordinary. On the other hand, it would be unheard of today. Our descendants are going to have an awful time trying to write about or understand us because we leave nothing behind. It's all electronic, so it's often cyberspace as soon as we've written it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have very little paper surviving. So in a way, it's easier to write about people 200 years ago than it is to write about somebody today.
Yeah, and his story, what interested me, too, about what I wanted to ask you was that, okay, so just to give a little bit of background for people who don't know that much about him, when he did marry for the first time, and he married Zachary Taylor's daughter, right, who's called Noxie, you had said that he had carried around letters from her, that he had kept. Were those letters available, or that was just what you found out that he did?
Well, this is an old recollection now, but I think those are gone.
Mm.
I think his letters to her and letters from her, very few, if any, survive. You see, a lot of, for all that survives for Davis, a lot of his stuff was lost as well in his plantation, Briarfield, was overrun by federal soldiers in the Vicksburg campaign, and the house was. Everything, they didn't burn it, but they pretty much trashed the house. They got furniture out of it. Any paintings that were there got ruined. They found his papers that were there were found scattered all over the yard. The books were taken as souvenirs. So we don't know how much actually disappeared that we'll never get back. But some Davis letters do show up in the oddest places. Up in Northern University Library archives. They have no business being there, but obviously some soldier who grabbed a couple of souvenirs later donated them to the library, and so a few of these things still survive. And I think virtually any correspondence between himself and Sarah Taylor met that sort of fate. But whether it was in 1863 or whether he destroyed it himself, or it's hard to say. It may even be that his second wife, Verena, destroyed it because I think she was kind of jealous of his first wife.
Yes, it seemed like she had a lot of those. Well, and another thing that I thought was so interesting is that he meets Andrew Jackson as a young boy. And it always, like, when I'm reading history, I always find it so interesting at how it connects. Like, he's born very close to where Lincoln was born. He meets Andrew Jackson, before he even realizes who Andrew Jackson is going to be eventually. And then I look at Andrew Jackson's life and his life, and I think from reading Andrew Jackson's biographies, they both had like such a sad life. And, when I was reading him, I was like, that life back then, it was just so tough. Was it that tough, or was it that his was just that tough? Because it seemed like, he was battling chronic illness constantly. Yeah. He loses the love of his life 3 months after he marries her, but he survives. And, it just goes on and on. It seems like he's always battling illness, always battling something. It's like, when was he happy? When did he find happiness? I'm not sure that he did, even when he was Confederate president.
I don't think he was a very happy man. As I've said, he's a difficult man to like.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hard to empathize with him when you realize how much he lost. This is a man who had 4 sons and outlived all of them. He lost Sarah Taylor, who was the real love of his life. A brief marriage, and I'm convinced he felt guilty for her death. He felt some degree of responsibility for it. Because he took her down south in the yellow fever season, and she caught it and died. He knew it was dangerous to do that and did it anyhow. The Confederacy is essentially his creation, as it not at the beginning, but certainly what it turned into. And so there's virtually another one of his offspring, another child that he saw die before him, and he lost pretty much everything. And just kept soldiering on. He's an incredibly determined fellow. He's a very, very strong, almost rigid character. So it's possible to admire and empathize with him, even if you find that you can't like him very much because of his pretty stiff personality. But one of the things that I certainly empathize with him about is all that he lost and that he really was not a man who was ever very happy in his own skin. The only occasions I remember coming across when he just seemed almost boyishly happy was when he was with children. He loved children. He loved Christmas with children, and he got along wonderfully with children. He also got along very well with women and with blacks, both free and slave.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in that era, they are all subordinate to an adult white male, so he's in a position of nobody's really going to challenge him. He could not get along with another strong-willed white male like himself. He always had to lock horns with him somehow.
Right.
So he's not a happy man, I don't think. As for the illness, he did have wretched health off and on through his life, but that's not unusual in that era. For that matter, neither is the loss of so many children.
Mm-hmm.
These are fairly commonplace, but they're shocking to us today because we're so insulated from death thanks to medicine.
Right. And, that's what I was thinking about, too. I mean, I know the history of my great-grandparents, and they went through the same kind of thing. It wasn't like he wasn't the only one, and I'm sure, of the people he knew that did lose children, even though it did seem, when you're going through it, it seems so tragic. He wasn't the only one. But what I liked, one thing that you had said, and I'm not sure if I read this in the book or saw you because I was watching some of your YouTube videos, and the thing that I think we can empathize with him is that, first of all, he wasn't necessarily fighting for Mississippi to secede. He wasn't necessarily fighting for that. He was trying to hold it off as much as possible. And slavery to him, he was so good to his slaves. It's almost like he didn't understand, because without slaves, he only knew slaves. He didn't know life without slaves. I think that those people didn't know, what was that going to be? I think they were scared of it because it was their livelihood, and they didn't know what they were going to do if they didn't have slaves. So I think that's why they held onto it so tightly, not in a necessarily mean way, because we know that he wasn't mean to his slaves. We know he took very good care of them and considered them family. So, I just think...
enormously indulgent of his slaves, as was his brother, Samuel, who was really sort of his father figure. Davis actually had traveled very little in the South prior to the Civil War. He had traveled more in the North. So he knew very little from first-hand observation of sort of the slave situation in the South at large. And I think, can't prove it, I just think this, that he sort of believed that the way it was on his plantation is the way it was everywhere. His slaves had considerable freedom. They could raise crops in their free time, to earn money, to buy themselves things. He provided religious instruction for them. He provided a school teacher for them even after educating slaves was outlawed in Mississippi, as it was in most of the other southern states. He was very reluctant for a slave to be punished, and in fact, if slaves were punished for something, it was done by their peers in a court of their peers. He stayed out of a trial. So he's very atypical of the southern slaveholder. And I think he genuinely did believe that it was a benevolent institution that was uplifting for the blacks who were just sort of earning their way to being civilized by being slaves. And for him, as you were saying, he was, there's no question, he was a staunch Southern rights Democrat at the time, but he was not one of those preaching secession. He did regard it as a lawful right but that should only be resorted to in the utmost extremity. And he really didn't think, even with the election of Abraham Lincoln, I don't think he really thought that they reached the last extremity. There should still be some basis for compromise. And, of course, he had no choice when Mississippi seceded. His first loyalty was to his state, and then, of course, he went south. I think he had no desire whatever to be president. It was later said of him, and even by him, that he would have preferred to have been a soldier in the field. And I think that's true. Davis did not have the makeup to be a chief executive. He was a bureaucrat by instinct, and bureaucrats are necessary, but they make lousy presidents. Even his own wife said he did not know the art of politics. and he was a terrible politician in the practical aspects of getting along and the give and take of politics. And he knew that instinctively, but when he was offered the presidency, elected really, there was no way he could turn it down.
Mhm. And I find it interesting, his second marriage to Verena, he's 18 years older than her. And I was thinking, like now in this day, like that's a considerable amount. I don't know what it was like back then, if it was frowned upon or because of who he was. I guess her family did have some misgivings about it, but ultimately allowed the marriage to happen.
It's not that unusual, especially if the older man was well-to-do. From a relatively prominent family, and it's not that unusual today. Our president today has a wife who's, 20-some years younger.
That's true. I didn't even think of that, actually.
I think when dealing with men in powerful positions or men of wealth, that age difference, people found ways to rationalize the way around it.
Right. And I felt bad for her because when she got into the marriage, right away he was already off on politics. He was already involved and away a lot. And it is shocking how long it took them to have their first child because of their distance, correct?
Well, they essentially had a couple of what we would call separations.
Right.
On one instance, he simply left her in Mississippi, refused to take her to Washington with him when he went to serve in Congress, because he told her, quite frankly, that she was querulous. She questioned him. She didn't knuckle under and obey, and she made it intolerable to be around her because she didn't know her place.
Which is also interesting.
Yeah.
For that time.
Yeah, Verena is in many ways a very 20th century woman. In some ways, she's more interesting than Jefferson Davis. Very intelligent, very well read. Her interests were those of men. She liked to talk politics, the world affairs, and of course, the women were not allowed in those conversations in that era, which she found very frustrating. And the reason the marriage finally lasted as long as it did is that she knuckled under and she played the game. I swear I could see after he died, she wrote a big, fat, 2-volume memoir of her husband. Excuse me. And I swear I can see places in there where she's subtly getting her own back at him with a little comment about his shortcomings here or there, things that she was not allowed to say when he was alive.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and then eventually, I guess, when they did connect and then they started having children, it seemed like their marriage did get better.
Yeah.
The children.
It reminds me in a way of the Clintons, and don't take that comparison too far. But you look at Hillary Clinton's interests, which are policy and foreign affairs and things of that sort, not what even today are still typically regarded as matters of high professional interest to women. And you look at that marriage and whatever else is right or wrong with it, there's never been much question that it was a political partnership. And I think that's kind of what Jefferson and Verena had toward the end. There may not have been strong romance or passionate love, but there was a partnership and a sense of investment and responsibility with each other, which is why she left him years after the war when he was writing his memoir, and he got a woman named Sarah Dorsey who was helping him to write it. And Verena said, "How dare you? I was your helpmate. I was your wife during all of these times. It's my honor and my responsibility to help you with that book. You sort of left me out of the partnership." She refused to come live with him until Sarah Dorsey moved out.
Interesting. So, and then just, back it up a little bit. So when the Civil War is going on, what would he, as a president, what would have been his duty? Like, was he overseeing what the troops were doing? Did he have a say in what was happening with them?
He certainly did. He, like Lincoln, took the commander-in-chief clause of the Constitution.
Okay.
Seriously. Indeed, one of the reasons Davis was chosen as president originally by some people was that they thought he would actually go out and lead their armies in the field because he was one of the South's foremost military heroes, thanks to his performance in the war with Mexico some years before.
Right.
And he certainly would have had that prerogative, but he never seriously thought of doing it. But Davis did feel a right and a responsibility to insert himself into military affairs. He was accused at the time, and even more so since, of interfering too much, which I think is really not the case. But there's no question he micromanaged in some areas more than he should have. When the Confederacy was getting started, he was choosing the cloth for Confederate uniforms and getting involved in the design of the buttons. That's not what a chief executive should be spending. But I think, in part because, and there's that bureaucrat's instinct. I think Davis could feel like he was getting somewhere if he accomplished a lot of little things when it was so difficult to accomplish even one big thing. So he could sort of keep himself going by inserting himself in these smaller matters. I don't think he hurt the Confederate cause. I think the Confederate cause was almost guaranteed from the beginning to lose, and nothing Davis did. If anything, Davis probably helped it to live longer than it would have. But there's no question he exercised his full rights and prerogatives as president and did not let anybody step in the way or try to tread in his area of responsibility. He jerked them up pretty quickly.
And it just seemed like you had said a little bit earlier, like he would refuse to accept that it could possibly, even when Lee was telling him that it was over, it was like he refused to accept that the whole thing could just be over, correct?
Right. I think, of course, it's dangerous and unwise ever to put somebody who's been dead 150 years on the couch and try to psychoanalyze them.
Right.
But I have often wondered if in those last days of April and May of 1865, if Davis wasn't intermittently delusional, because he'd start talking sometimes about phantom legions of Confederate soldiers coming out of the hills and rallying around his banners, the lame, the halt, the deserters, people who'd avoided the draft in the first place. Somehow or other, he had in mind that he could ride west toward the Mississippi and a whole new huge army would rally around him and he could lead it back east and retake what had been lost. But everybody around him in his cabinet realized that was just a pipe dream.
Mm-hmm.
And he would lapse into and out of that. But he'd occasionally sort of admit that, okay, the game is up and it's time, just to put an end to this. And then a few hours later, he could be back again talking about the Phantom Legions. And as I said earlier, I think it was just impossible for him to reshape his mind to accept the death of something that he'd created, just like the deaths of the two of his sons to date who had died at that point. Right.
And then, so Lincoln dies and he starts and he runs. So he doesn't want, he doesn't surrender, like Lee surrenders, but then he runs, that he has to be captured. Would it have been easier? I guess it would have been easier for him if he would have done the same thing that Lee did, correct?
I don't know if it would have been easier in what happened with Davis after the war if he surrendered. He's really, when he's captured, the people who are around him think they persuaded him to get to the Florida coast, to get in a boat that's waiting for him, and to escape to Bermuda or to Cuba and England. They don't want their president to go on trial for treason, and possibly face execution, which is, after all, was the prescribed penalty for treason. In part because those who are around him realize the South now has to find its way back into the Union, and the worst thing that could happen would be for Southern leaders to be turned into martyrs with executions as rallying points for people who'd refused to accept the way things were. But I think Davis's intention always was to get to Texas, where there was still there was an army, really a disintegrating army, but an army commanded by General Kirby Smith in Texas. I think he really intended to get there to try to keep the fight going. But whether he was captured that way or whether he turned himself in, either way, he was going to be sent to prison, as were all of the other top political leaders of the Confederacy, and would still, I think, have had to go through what he did as the government decided whether or not to try him, and if so, what to try him for, and how to deal with this hot potato. Lincoln wanted Davis to be allowed to escape from the country. Lincoln was wise enough to know that the North had nothing whatever to gain from capturing Davis and putting him on trial. It would make Reconstruction that much more difficult if he was executed, or even if he was imprisoned for a long time. He'd become a martyr, a rallying point for resistance.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so interesting that, so they kept him he was in prison for 2 years.
Yeah.
What made them decide that was long enough? Like did they just,
he's charged, he's indicted for treason.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a federal district court in Richmond. That court's still there. The realization, Lincoln is dead, of course, but the leaders in Washington all realize that this is a hot potato, because if it goes to trial, and Davis wanted the trial because he was convinced, as always, that he could win.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he went to trial for treason, then the issue became, what was treason? Was it treason for the southern state to have seceded and for him to follow his state? And that argument is still going on today as to whether or not it's constitutionally lawful for a state to secede. There's no provision anywhere in the Constitution or federal statute saying you can secede, but there was nothing saying you couldn't.
Right.
And the people of Washington are concerned, oh my God, what happens if he puts up a good enough defense that he's found not guilty? Then this whole war we have just fought to put down secession will be shown to the world as having been essentially a war of conquest against people who were just exercising their constitutional rights. Much, much easier simply to decide to issue a null pros, a decision not to prosecute, and to free him. And that's what he did. That's why there are no political trials after the Civil War.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes total sense now. I mean, like I said, this is all new. Reading this stuff now is all new to me because this isn't stuff that we learn about, And then what I found fascinating is that he survives, 12 years after his release? Something like that?
He lived until 1888.
1889. Oh, yeah, 1880. Oh, right. Okay. So, yeah, Right. He survives so much longer. As I'm reading it, I'm thinking, how does this man, he's just so sick all the time, and he's had malaria or yellow fever numerous times in his life and survives it,
He's blind in one eye. He's intermittently tormented by a wound in his leg that never properly healed from the Mexican War. He's sort of dyspeptic. He eats cornbread and buttermilk. He has a terrible diet. And it is kind of amazing. He just soldiers on. But, he lives to be 81, 82.
81, yeah, exactly. And because of your book, I have to say that at the beginning of the book, I wasn't sure I was going to like him. He was a tough character to like. But by the end, I did have a heart for him and everything that he lived through and did. And like I said, he wasn't a mean-spirited guy. He was just doing what he thought was right. And
I think it's possible to feel sorry for him without necessarily condoning his cause. And I think before anybody condemns what the Confederates did, they need to try to put themselves in their place and say, what would they have done in similar circumstances under the threats that they perceived, whether they're real or not, is immaterial. The fact that they believed that they were under threat is what made them act, and people always act on the basis of belief over fact.
Right. And they were fighting it was more than just slavery. It was, fighting for them as states with rights and what kind of rights they were going to have on their own as a part of the nation, and kind of being told what it was going to be, not really having much of a say a lot of the times.
In some degree. Ultimately, it always comes down to slavery.
Yeah.
It defines everything. It defined power. It defined wealth. It defined personal status. It defined the social matrix of the Old South. It's impossible for us, I think, to grasp today how inextricably intertwined slavery was with the whole Southern cosmos.
Right.
And the big problem, of course, really was not with the issue of emancipation or something like that in 1860. The problem was the election of Abraham Lincoln on a platform that called for containing the spread of slavery so that it couldn't spread any farther. And slave owners and the leading politicians believed, and rightly so, I think, that containment meant ultimate death. Because the more new states come into the Union, that there's no chance for any more new slave states. Ultimately, at some point, a time would come when there were enough free states that they could pass a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. And so ultimately there was a threat, and you realized that slaves represented a $1 billion capital investment. It was the single largest capital investment in the South, worth far more than Southern land. A threat to that was a threat of financial ruin to a number of people, and they were absolutely terrified of what would happen socially if all of a sudden they've got 3.5 million slaves who are free in their midst.
Right.
What's going to happen? They're terrified of social collapse and upheaval.
Right.
It's an extremely complicated problem that it's difficult to explain. It's a whole lot more than just the issue of how awful it is, to own another human being. That's bad enough, but it goes far deeper than that and really into almost every facet of Southern life.
And isn't it interesting, you always look back and, okay, so that was the 1860s, and now here we are, how many years later, and it doesn't, of course it's gotten better. Of course it has. But the fact that it's still an issue, that racism is still around, and we're still, having discussions, and my children are still, I figured by the time my children were raised, they wouldn't even be having discussions about it anymore. And, it seems like it's such a never-ending topic.
Yeah, and we've never completely come to grips with it. And part of the reason for that, unfortunately, is all this mythology that's grown up around the Confederacy. And there's a small but extremely vocal group who like to maintain that slavery had nothing whatever to do with secession, and an even smaller subset of that group are the bunch who like to go around maintaining that there were really tens of thousands of Negro soldiers in the Confederate Army, which is complete nonsense. But if they get you to believe that, then what does that say about the war being about slavery? Couldn't have been about slavery because our blacks were happy and patriotic, and they wanted to fight for the Confederacy too. It's still wrapped up in social attitudes today about race and about politics. Things are much, much better, I think, than they were even when I was young.
Yes.
But it may never go away, and of course now we're seeing it. We're seeing a lot of that dynamic shift toward the Muslims. Right. And who knows, with 20 years from now, maybe some other ethnicity. That it's kind of the great bogeyman that we can know very little about, and therefore it's very easy to believe all manner of silly things about them.
Right. Well, right. And that's why I love reading history books, is because I always think that if you can just go back and see, where it started and what the truth was, and that's what my heart is in history. I love reading history books, and this is one of the best ones. So I have to tell everybody, if you want to know anything about the Civil War in the context of Jefferson Davis, I learned a lot more about other things other than Jefferson Davis, but I certainly learned everything I never knew about him, and it was an amazing. But like I said, it read so. I know it looks big, and it probably a lot of people are like, "Oh my gosh, I don't think I can do it." But it reads so well that you can do it. And if you love reading history books, this is basically one you should definitely consider reading. So, thank you so much. Yes, I really did. Thank you so much for giving me your time and to discuss this. It was so much fun.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll sit down one of these days and write another big fat book for you to read.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. You have a great day.
Right up.
Okay. Bye-bye.